There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years, 3 years, about an upcoming civil war in the United States, and about the idea that we are going to break out into fighting. I wrote a dystopian novel about the possibility of civil war coming to the United States. The whole point of the dystopian novel is that it is about 5 steps removed from reality. We are not there yet, right? There are indicators that conflict is on the way, but the idea that there's going to be some great armed conflict or that we are in the middle of the second civil war right now is just absurd. If you just walk around the United States, the idea that people are going to be shooting each other in the next couple of years is insane. You could not say the same thing in the lead up to the first Civil War. In the lead up to the first Civil War, you actually had a pre-Civil War in Kansas in 1856. It was called Bleeding Kansas, where slaveholders and advocates for slavery and free staters were actually going at it and shooting each other and murdering each other in relatively significant numbers in the state of Kansas. They actually had John Brown going down to Harper's Ferry and trying to lead a slave revolt, and almost a dozen people being shot, right? You actually had this sort of stuff happening on a fairly regular basis, and there was open talk about the possibility of a civil war leading up to the Civil War. It's very difficult to look at today's United States and figure that all the hemp smokers in San Francisco are going to be at war with the gun owners in Texas in the next few years. Yet, I think that both sides now have an interest in ramping up the rhetoric of civil war. So on the left, you have an interest in suggesting that fascism is on the way and that we are all going to be put under the tyrannical boot of the Trump administration. And on the right, you have an interest in suggesting that the resistance, the so-called resistance of the left, is going to lead to the outgrowth of a civil war. Now, I will admit that when you're in the political sphere and you're watching this stuff every day, it's very easy to be drawn into this sort of rhetoric. I don't think I've been immune to it over the course of my career. It's easy to get alarmist when you are immersed in politics every single day. And then you turn off Twitter and you go out into the world and you realize nobody's actually ready to shoot each other. And the number of people who are actually ready to clock each other, it's very, very low, which is why when things have come to blows, very often the government backs down. The case in point being, for example, the Bundy Ranch scenario where Cliven Bundy and his sons essentially told the federal government to stand down, and some of them were arrested, and then there was some jury nullification and nobody actually went to jail, right? When the possibility of actual violence is in the offing, it seems like there has been a generalized move to back off of that as opposed to exacerbating that. And the problem with the Civil War rhetoric is that what it actually does, it justifies any sort of behavior from any side. So Victor Davis Hanson, who's a terrific writer, Victor Davis Hanson has written some of my favorite books, particularly on the history of warfare. He has a piece over at National Review with which I significantly disagree, okay? And it's called The Origins of Our Second Civil War. And he writes, how, when, and why has the United States now arrived at the brink of a veritable civil war? Almost every cultural and social institution has not just been politicized, but also weaponized. Now, again, I don't know what that means, that these things have been, quote unquote, weaponized. They have been politicized, but weaponized is a bit of an extreme term, that sports has been weaponized. It has been politicized. It has not been weaponized in the sense that you're now banned from participating in sports if you happen to be a conservative, or you're banned if you happen to be somebody on the left. But Victor Davis Hanson continues, Donald Trump's election was not so much a catalyst for the divide as a manifestation and amplification of the existing schism. Agree with that. But he says, we are now nearing a point comparable to 1860 and perhaps past 1968. Left-right factionalism is increasingly fueled by geography, always history's force multiplier of civil strife. Red and blue states ensure that locale magnifies differences that were mostly manageable during the administrations of Ford, Carter, Reagan, the Bushes, and Clinton. So he says that the country is polarizing along geographic lines. He says that globalization has undermined national unity because we have these iconic billionaires in high tech and finance and coastal elites, but it's hollowed out the muscular jobs largely in the American interior. This is just not true. Technology has largely muscled out a lot of those jobs. The manufacturing capacity of the United States has actually risen over the past 3 decades. It's just the technology has gotten a lot better because as a country, we have moved more in the direction of technology doing work that human hands used to do. That doesn't mean that we can't solve that with job retraining and with programs designed to get people into new industries. But the idea that globalization is what is driving all of this angst, I think, is not correct. He says high tech has driven a lot of this, the mass production of cheap consumer goods. This is driving the second Civil War. Campuses are driving the second Civil War. You know, as somebody who has been, literally banned from campuses, campuses are a terrible place very often. But I've spoken on probably 50 campuses in the last couple of years, and 45 of them were mostly okay. Illegal immigration, he says the Obama project, I agree with all of his critiques of where the United States is going wrong. So I think it's all leading to a second Civil War. I really don't. Now I want to explain what could lead to a second Civil War. Okay, now what actually could lead to a second Civil War, I don't think is any of these outside forces. I don't think that it's globalization. I don't think it's illegal immigration. I don't even think that it was the terrible Obama presidency, which I think really did exacerbate a lot of the gaps in the United States. I don't think economics is what's going to lead to a second civil war. Victor Davis Hanson in National Review, he says, a steady 3 to 4% growth in annual GDP would trim a lot of cultural rhetoric. 4% unemployment will make more Americans valuable and give them advantages with employers. Measured meritocratic, diverse legal immigration would help to restore the melting pot. Reforming the university would help to mostly by abolishing tenure, requiring an exit competence exam for BA degrees. And then he gets to the one thing that I think is correct. Okay, here's the one thing that I think Victor Davis Hanson says that is correct. He's ignored it through most of the article, but this is where I think that he is right. He says, religious and spiritual reawakening is crucial. The masters of the universe of Silicon Valley did not, as promised, bring us New Age tranquility, but rather only greater speed and intensity to do what we always do. Trolling, doxing, phishing were just new versions of what Jesus warned about in the Sermon on the Mount. Spiritual transcendence is the timeless water of life. Technology is simply the delivery pump. We confuse the two. This I totally agree with. Okay, this is the part where he is totally right. One of the things that has happened is that we have polarized along technological lines because it is easy to sit behind your keyboard on Twitter and say mean things to other people you would never say to them in person. It's easy when you don't go to church to slander your neighbors as people without teeth, as Mark Caputo was doing. It is very easy when you don't actually have a community you feel a sense of belonging to talk about going to war with all of your neighbors. All that stuff is social isolation has actually increased in a time of social networking, which is one of the great ironies of the rise of technology. We spend less time with human beings and we spend more time online pretending to be with human beings and treating people how we would not want to be treated did we actually meet people in regular life. What's missing is the spiritual component, the sense that we're all in the fight together. And that's been missing for a while in the United States. That's nothing new. The problem is that all of the Civil War talk actually exacerbates the problem. And this is the problem I have with the Civil War talk. The Civil War talk, and you want to talk about a crisis of American conscience, I'm with you. If you want to talk about a crisis of American spirituality, I'm totally with you. If you want to talk about a crisis in the West of meaning and purpose, not only am I with you, I wrote an entire book on it. I wrote an entire book on this crisis of meaning, what we've lost, why we lost it. I think that we've lost a couple of things in the West. I think we've lost the idea of a Judeo-Christian value system that bound us all together. And we also lost the idea of reason as a universal solvent that was going to help bring us together and also grant us the capacity to talk with one another. And we've broken down into identity politics and subjectivism. I think there are a lot of things that have gone wrong with our culture, but talking about civil war only exacerbates the problem, because the problem with saying that we're on the verge of a second civil war is that it actually encourages you to look at people across the aisle from you and not see the common face of an American, but see somebody who is your enemy attempting to destroy the United States. And that's not to say that conflicts between left and right don't exist. They do. And I think the left is dead wrong on virtually all of these issues. I think fighting leftist principles is a deeply important thing because I think the left is complicit in the destruction of these central ideals of America that bind us together. I think the left has forcibly attempted to destroy the Judeo-Christian fabric. I think that the left has abandoned reason on behalf of subjective feeling. But I also think that most people in the United States are not, quote unquote, on the left. I think most people in the United States simply are told certain things by the media, and they believe those things because members of the media say them. I think a lot of people in the United States don't even think about policy very often. They don't think about politics very often. And if they do think about politics, I think they are driven into a state of insanity by all of the talk of this sort of civil war mentality. The war is on. America's on the verge of destruction. The greatest, freest country in the history of the world, most prosperous country in the history of the world. We're on the verge of chaos. That sort of talk, I think, makes things worse. I don't think we're on the verge of chaos, but I think that we have to look at the underlying trends and try to reverse them. I think that would be the best way to talk about this. We're not on the verge of the collapse of the United States. We are not. And Donald Trump is not a symptom of that, nor is he a cause of that. We are not on the verge of the collapse of the United States. 500 disgusting idiots marching in Charlottesville is not the collapse of the United States, right? Even the shooting of Congress people by an evil Bernie Sanders supporter, that is not the collapse of the United States, right? The United States is a lot more durable than that because it was built on these principles. What is the collapse of the United States is when we forget about this common fabric. I still believe most Americans believe in the certain set of decency brought about by Judeo-Christian values. Even if people don't go to church, I think they believe in those values. They just don't know where they came from, which means it's our job to reinstill those values. It's our job to talk about those values, to talk about where they came from, why they are important, why people should go to church, why people should go to synagogue. At the same time, we have to talk about why it is that reason is necessary, why it is that classical liberalism, the idea that we are free because we have certain inalienable rights, why our reason allows us to have a republic where we can sit and talk together, why that stuff is actually important. right? Arguments over the tax rates are not going to destroy the United States. Abandonment of reason and abandonment of values are going to destroy the United States. And the problem is, once you get into a mentality that we are in a war, wartime mentality encourages people to abandon morality. People are at their worst in a war. And one of the weird things about the way that we perceive war in the modern world, because so few of us have actually been in the military, only a small percentage of Americans actually even know people who have been in the military or deal with people in the military on a regular basis. Because of that, we tend to think that war makes the best of people. When we watch war movies, we see, oh, look at the unity of the guys in Band of Brothers. Look how they came together. Look how in a war, there's a common sense of purpose. This is why so many folks, particularly on the political left, like to talk about the war on poverty. People on the right will talk about the war on illegal immigration, the war on Christmas. We're constantly using the language of war because we think that war brings us together and refines us, that pressure turns us into a purer version of ourselves. The worst atrocities in the history of mankind have happened during war. The reason for that is because once you believe that you are fighting in a battle, once you believe that your life is at stake, once you believe that war is at your front door, you are willing to do almost anything in order to prevent yourself from losing that war. Once you believe that the country is one step away from its end, it's pretty easy to justify doing virtually anything. And I think that that's having a pretty significant impact, this sort of Civil War rhetoric, on how people think on both the left and on the right. So let's take an example. Over the last 24 hours, several members of the Trump administration have talked about Russian meddling in elections. And they talked about how bad it is. So Mike Pence, the vice president, he says that Russian meddling is offensive to democracy. Of course, he's exactly right.
The fact is, Russia meddled in our 2016 elections. Russia's goal was to sow discord and division and to weaken the American people's faith in our democracy. And while no actual votes were changed, any attempt to interfere in our elections is an affront to our democracy, and it will not be allowed.
Okay, so that's right. What Mike Pence says there is exactly right. And then Christian Nielsen, who's the Homeland Security Secretary, she comes out and she says election meddling is happening in real time.
Americans need to be aware that it's a very real threat. It's happening real time. FBI has lead on that. They have a task force. We support them. And we work with the private sector, such as Facebook, companies like Facebook, to try to pull down content that is inauthentic.
Okay, so there is a real problem with the Russians meddling in our election. Now, if you're a patriotic American who believes that Western civilization actually requires defense, you should be offended by the idea of a country like Russia attempting to meddle in our elections. The idea that Vladimir Putin, who's a thug dictator who murders dissidents, interfering in our elections should be offensive to you no matter where you stand on the political aisle. I was deeply offended when Barack Obama said to Dmitry Medvedev in 2012 that he wanted flexibility from the Russian government so that he could act, that if they were kind to him and didn't do anything, he would provide them flexibility in his next administration. It was disgusting. Russian interference in the election is a bad thing. But there's a new poll out today, and this is, I think, an outgrowth of a Civil War mentality. There's a new poll out today, and here was the question in the poll. If Russia were to help the Republicans or Democrats keep or win control of Congress in the November elections, do you think their actions would be appropriate, inappropriate, but not a big deal, or inappropriate and it's a big deal? So according to Republicans, people who lean Republican, fully 40% of Republicans say it would either be appropriate for the Russians to interfere in our elections to help Republicans win, or that it wouldn't be appropriate, but it wouldn't be all that big a deal if the Russians interfere in our elections to help us win. 40% of Republicans say that it's not that big a deal if the Russians actually interfered in our elections and we knew that they were interfering in our elections. 4 in 10. 55% say it's not appropriate and it would be a big deal, which means that's the correct 55%. Democrats now say 14% say that it would be inappropriate but not a big deal. 86% say it would not be appropriate and it would be a big deal. Okay, so that is a massive gap.